and others lost in a labyrinth of confused thoughts. But despite their mental struggles, there was a certain peace to their presence. They had a way of calming the nurse with their stories of the past, however fragmented they might be. Among the patients there was one woman who stood out, Lena. She was frail, with silver hair and a gentle smile, but her mind was often clouded with anxiety. Lena had a particular way of clinging to the nurse, almost as if the presence of someone young and vibrant could tether her to reality. It was clear to the nurse that the other patients in the ward, who often roamed silently in their own worlds, had become accustomed to Lena's increasingly erratic behaviors. But to the nurse, who had always taken special care in soothing her patients, Lena's stories were a reminder of the invisible battles the elderly faced every day. Lena would often describe the same haunting scene whenever the nurse entered her room. "The man in black," she would say, her voice trembling. "He's in the corner, watching me." The nurse, though unnerved, remained calm. She had seen many patients speak of hallucinations or have vivid dreams of lost loved ones. Alzheimer's could manifest in strange ways, after all. But Lena's description was too vivid, too consistent to dismiss as just another passing delusion. Each time the nurse entered Lena's room, the elderly woman would point to the same corner and talk about the man dressed entirely in black, a figure that never seemed to speak, but who appeared to be watching her with a cold, knowing smile. The nurse, trying to remain professional, would sit with Lena, holding her hand, soothing her fears. "It's just the illness, Lena," she would say softly, trying to bring comfort. But the unsettling feeling never left her. One evening, while stocking supplies in his small linen closet, something happened that she couldn't easily explain. The room was small and silent, the only sound the faint rustling of sheets and the soft clink of metal as she arranged her cot. She was working in a near trance, having been awake for hours on end. Just as she reached for another stack of towels, she felt a sudden and unmistakable sensation, a heavy, cold hand pressing firmly on her shoulder. The air around her seemed to shift, and she spun around, heart racing, expecting to find one of her colleagues standing there, maybe playing a prank. But the room was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she stood frozen, staring into the empty space, the eerie feeling still lingering like a shadow. But there was no one there. She told herself it was just exhaustion, maybe a trick of the mind from the long hours. Yet the feeling remained as though something unseen had brushed against her. She tried to push it aside, returning to her work, but her thoughts were preoccupied by what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was it the stress of her shift, or something else? Later that night, when most of the ward was asleep, the nurse was passing by a small glass window near the door to the ward's exit. The glass was fogged by the cool night air, and for a brief second she saw something that froze her in place. Standing just outside the door, looking directly at her through the glass, was the figure, a man dressed entirely in black. His features were shadowed, but his grin was unmistakable, a smile that didn't seem to reach his eyes, as though he were amused by something she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, and before she could even think, she screamed, the sound echoing down the long, quiet hallway. But when she turned back to the glass, he was gone, vanished. She rushed out of the linen room and into the hall, her body trembling. She frantically searched for another nurse, but the ward was eerily quiet. No one was around. She looked through every room, even checked the entrance to the building, but there was no one to be found. It was as if the man had disappeared into thin air. In the chaos of her panic, she returned to Lena's room to find the elderly woman staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. Lena had been woken by the nurse's scream, and in her dazed state she muttered, "The man in black. He's coming for us." The nurse, still reeling from the strange encounter, asked Lena, almost afraid to hear the answer, what the man in black looked like. Without hesitation, Lena began describing him in detail. He was tall, with a dark coat, and he smiled at me, like he knew something terrible was coming. The nurse's blood ran cold. The description was identical to what she had seen outside the glass door just moments before. She wasn't sure if she was imagining things or if there was something more sinister at work in the hospital, but she could no longer ignore the feeling that she wasn't alone in the ward. That night, as the nurse was finishing her shift, Lena's screams echoed through the ward once more. The elderly woman was in full panic, thrashing in her bed, unable to escape the terror she saw in her mind. "Get me out of here," she screamed. "He's coming. He's coming for us." The nurse, too shaken to continue, quickly called for help. But the unease that had settled over her was overwhelming. The next morning, after the shift had ended, the nurse made a decision that would forever change her life. She texted the head nurse, informing her that her next shift would be her last. The hospital and the unnerving experience with Lena and the man in black had left her deeply unsettled. She wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion, the isolation, or something far beyond explanation, but she knew she could never return. She had seen something or someone that shouldn't have been there, and it haunted her every waking moment. The nurse would never forget the feeling of that hand on her shoulder, nor the image of the man in black smiling through the glass. Was it a figment of her imagination, born from exhaustion and fear, or was it something far darker, a presence that had been lurking in the hospital long before she ever set foot inside? To this day, she still wonders if Lena had known more than she let on, if the old woman had been seeing the truth all along. The nurse, her mind still haunted by the eerie encounter with Lena and the man in black, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling as she prepared to leave the hospital. With trembling hands, she texted the head nurse. "I can't do this anymore. My next shift will be my last. Last night was too much for me." She had always prided herself on being strong, professional, and capable of handling the toughest situations, but something about that night had cracked her composure. The experience, so vivid and terrifying, had left her questioning her own senses, and she could no longer ignore the fear gnawing at her. As she sent the message, the thought of never stepping foot inside that hospital again gave her a strange sense of relief, though the haunting memories would linger far longer than she expected. A few days passed before she was able to put the experience behind her. But then another story surfaced that would send a chill down her spine, a reminder that the lines between the living and the supernatural are often blurrier than we think. This story was shared by a woman who had contracted a rare and severe case of bacterial meningitis. The woman, named Sarah, had been living in South Florida when she suddenly started feeling unwell, nausea, confusion, intense headaches, and a lack of appetite. But it wasn't until the hallucinations started that Sarah knew something was seriously wrong. At first, she brushed it off as the side effects of a bad flu or exhaustion, but the voices she heard from downstairs made her question everything. One evening, as Sarah lay in bed, her head pounding and her body too weak to move, she heard a child's voice calling from the floor below. "Mom?" The sound was so clear, so distinct, that it pierced through her feverish delirium. She froze, her heart racing, certain she must be dreaming. The thing was, Sarah had no children. She had never been pregnant, and her home was empty, just her and her husband, Jason. The voice echoed again. "Mom, are you there?" Terrified and confused, Sarah mustered all her strength and dragged herself out of bed, hoping to find the source of the voice. But when she reached the top of the stairs, the house was eerily silent. The voice never came again. Still unsure of what she had just experienced, she called her husband, her voice trembling. She was so distressed she could barely explain the situation, but Jason assured her that she must have imagined it. He hurried home from work, concerned about her state. Yet, as Sarah waited for him to arrive, the hallucinations only worsened. While changing out of her pajamas, she felt another wave of nausea, causing her to rush to the bathroom. As she was mid-throw-up, she heard a voice again. But this time it wasn't the child's voice. It was a low, eerie sound coming from outside the bathroom door. She couldn't quite make out the words, but it sounded like a whisper, and the tone felt menacing. At that moment, she was certain that whatever was happening to her was beyond ordinary illness. By the time Jason arrived, Sarah was on the floor, clutching her stomach, delirious and barely able to speak. He immediately rushed her to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had contracted bacterial meningitis, a severe infection that, if untreated, could be deadly. The doctor explained that the hallucinations were a common but dangerous side effect, a result of the infection's toll on the brain. Sarah was given antibiotics right away, and the doctor warned her that if she had waited any longer, her condition could have been fatal. The hallucinations began to fade as the antibiotics took effect, but the eerie experiences left Sarah shaken. As Sarah recovered, she had a strange, vivid dream. Or was it a hallucination? In her semi-conscious state, Sarah believed she saw her ex-husband, David, standing over her hospital bed. David had been abusive during their marriage, and their separation had been traumatic. But here he was, standing in front of her, his cold eyes watching her with a cruel smirk. He patted her head as if she were a child, and with a voice that sent a shiver down her spine, he spoke about her current husband, Jason. "I'm glad you're okay," David said in a mocking tone, "but he's not. He'll never be safe. I'm going to make sure he knows who's really in charge." Sarah's heart raced. She knew she wasn't dreaming. The words felt too real, too clear, and the presence of David was so tangible that it sent waves of fear through her. The nightmare continued as David ranted about how he despised Jason and how he intended to harm him. "You'll regret marrying him," David's voice echoed in the dream. "I'll make him pay." When Sarah woke the next morning, her head was still spinning from the lingering effects of the meningitis, but she knew she had to tell someone about the dream, or hallucination. She spoke with the nurse, describing the encounter. The nurse seemed concerned, but explained that the antibiotics Sarah was receiving could have caused delirium, a state where it's difficult to distinguish dreams from reality. Sarah nodded, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that what she had seen was real, that David had actually been there. The shock came later that day when a nurse mentioned that a cousin named David had visited Sarah in the night. Sarah's heart stopped. "David?" she asked, stunned. "I don't have any cousins here. My ex-husband's name is David. Did he visit me?" The nurse was insistent, explaining that a man identifying himself as her cousin had come to check on her, though he had left a few hours ago. Frightened, Sarah called her ex-husband to confront him. She sent a text message. "Why did you come to the hospital? What did you say to my nurses?" A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "I never visited you. You must have imagined it. I'm just making sure you're okay." Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. She had heard the threats clearly in her delirium, felt his presence in the room with her. But according to David's message, it was all in her head. She texted back, furious and confused. "You're lying. I remember everything. And I'm not going to let you hurt Jason. Stay out of our lives or I'll get the police involved." David's response was terse and cold. "I never threatened anyone." "Don't make up lies." But Sarah wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The lines between reality and hallucination had become blurred in a way she could not explain. Had her ex-husband really been there? Or had it all been a product of her feverish mind, twisted by the infection in her brain? Even though her body was healing, the emotional scars from both her past with David and the bizarre hallucinations remained. As she lay in her hospital bed, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister behind it all, something that went beyond mere illness. The hallucinations had felt too real, too deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her from beyond the veil of consciousness. The narrator's story took a dramatic and terrifying turn when he met a girl named Francesca through Tinder. She was everything he had hoped for in a date: adventurous, confident, and with a flair for the unusual. Her profile caught his attention immediately. Her sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, her fiery red highlights, and her love for exploring forgotten places. One of her photos stood out in particular. It was taken on the rooftop of an abandoned hospital, the city skyline sprawling behind her. "It's an old abandoned hospital on the edge of town," she had written in her profile. "It's creepy, sure, but it's also super cool to explore at night, and it's really easy to get in if you know how to avoid the one cop who patrols the parking lot." Intrigued by her boldness and her love for the unconventional, the narrator quickly struck up a conversation. It wasn't long before she suggested they explore the hospital together as a sort of unconventional first date. Most people might have balked at the idea of spending a night in a crumbling, haunted building, but the narrator was all in. It sounded like the perfect adventure, a break from the mundane routine of bars and dinners. The night they met, they drove out to the hospital together, the streets growing emptier as they approached the derelict building. The place loomed in the distance, a massive structure of decaying brick and rusted metal, the windows boarded up or shattered. "We'll park here, on this dead-end street," Francesca said, pulling into a shadowy spot hidden by overgrown bushes. The air was thick with tension, and the narrator couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding settle over him as they both climbed out of the car. "It's just a 5-minute walk to the entrance," she added, as if this kind of thing was just a normal part of her routine. The two of them made their way across the dark parking lot, their footfalls echoing in the stillness of the night. The sense of isolation was palpable, and every rustling sound made the narrator's heart race a little faster. But Francesca seemed completely unfazed, chatting animatedly about her experiences exploring other abandoned places. She led the way to a broken window, the glass shards glittering in the moonlight like jagged teeth. With a practiced hand, she helped him climb inside. Once inside, the hospital was a maze of dim halls, decaying furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. The oppressive silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of their footsteps or the distant creak of old buildings. The hospital seemed to stretch endlessly, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors that seemed to go on forever. It was easy to lose track of time as they explored. The farther they ventured, the more the building seemed to consume them. As they reached the first floor, the atmosphere grew tense. Francesca's voice, normally lively, now sounded almost too loud in the silence. She kept talking about the hospital's history, about the rumors of hauntings and ghost sightings. The narrator was starting to feel the weight of the place, the way it seemed to breathe around them, as if the hospital itself was alive. And then, just as they rounded a corner, they both heard it, a soft, distant creak. It sounded like a door opening and closing, but it was far too deliberate. Francesca stopped mid-sentence, and the two of them froze. The noise echoed again, closer this time, and then a bang. "What was that?" the narrator whispered, his pulse quickening. Francesca's eyes widened. "I don't know. It could be other explorers, but I don't think anyone is supposed to be here. Let's turn off the lights and wait." They flicked off their flashlights, their breathing growing heavy in the suffocating darkness. The shadows seemed to press in on them, and the silence stretched on, broken only by the sounds of something or someone moving in the corridors nearby. A shuffling sound, a whispering breeze. The sense of being watched was palpable. Then suddenly there it was again, a sharp bang, this time much closer. It wasn't just a random noise, it was deliberate, a sound as though someone was trying to get their attention, to make their presence known. Francesca's eyes darted around nervously, and she grabbed the narrator's arm. "We need to move. Now." Without waiting another second, they scrambled through the dark, their feet slipping on the debris as they ran up a nearby staircase. But the sense of being followed was overwhelming. The footsteps they had heard earlier seemed to grow closer, echoing from behind them. "Someone's after us," the narrator said, his voice strained. Francesca nodded, her face pale but determined. "We need to get to the rooftop. It's the only place where we can catch our breath and figure out what's going on." They reached the rooftop, but the view was anything but calming. The lights of the city below seemed so far away, as though the world outside the hospital had ceased to exist. They huddled in the shadows, trying to steady their breath and listen for any sign of pursuit. But then they heard it. A voice, low and smooth, calling from below. "Come on down." The man was standing at the base of the pillar they were perched on, his voice echoing up toward them. He was dressed in all black jacket, black sweatpants. A dark beam pulled low over his face. He smiled up at them, a wide, chilling grin. "Come on down," he repeated, his voice deep and unnerving. "I won't bite. I just want to talk." Francesca tensed beside the narrator. "No way," she hissed. "That guy is not okay. We need to go." But as they turned to leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of the man's footsteps echoing through the hospital once again, following them up the stairs. The chase was on. They scrambled down the narrow wooden planks, fear pushing them forward as they raced through the dark, twisting hallways. Their flashlights barely illuminated the path ahead as they made their way back toward the basement. The man's footsteps grew louder, his pursuit relentless. Every corner they turned, every hallway they bolted down, seemed to stretch into an endless maze, and the sense of being trapped grew stronger with each passing second. Finally, they reached the basement, and without a second thought, they climbed through the broken window once again. The cold air hit them like a slap as they dropped to the ground, their legs trembling from the adrenaline. "That was too close," the narrator breathed, his heart still racing. Francesca nodded, a look of relief on her face. "We can't go back there. Not ever." They ran back across the parking lot to the car, their minds racing as they locked the doors. The hospital loomed behind them, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their every move. Neither of them spoke until they reached a nearby fast food joint. They pulled into the parking lot and, despite the tension that still clung to them, they couldn't help but laugh nervously. "I think we just survived a horror movie," the narrator said, shaking his head in disbelief. Francesca smiled, though it was tinged with a nervous energy. "Yeah, but I don't think we're ever going back there again." They spent the next hour talking, trying to process what had just happened. In that moment, the narrator realized how strong the bond between them had become, forged in the fire of fear and survival. What had started as an unusual date had transformed into something far deeper, a friendship born out of shared terror. And while their connection remained strong, neither of them ever returned to the abandoned hospital. It had become a dark chapter in their lives, a place filled with unsettling memories of the man in black who had tried to lure them into the darkness. From that night forward, they remained close friends, sharing their wild stories and adventures. But they both knew that certain places, certain experiences, were better left in the past. Second home relax. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, like a distant murmur that I could almost convince myself was my imagination. But as I listened more closely, the sounds became clearer. Laughter. It wasn't the laughter of adults or the nurses chatting as they made their rounds. No, this was unmistakably the laughter of children, bright, carefree, and full of energy. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The laughter sounded like it was coming from the playroom just across the hall from my room. The playroom was usually locked at night, as it was only meant for the younger patients during the day. This laughter seemed so real and so vibrant, as if a group of children were inside, playing, laughing, having fun. Yet, I knew the playroom was empty. It had to be. I listened more intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter continued for a few minutes, echoing in the quiet hall. It sounded like the children were running around, laughing, playing games, and shouting to each other. I even thought I heard a ball bounce against the walls. But that couldn't be possible. The playroom had been locked since the evening, and there were no children allowed to play at that time of night. I tried to shake it off. It had to be a trick of the mind, right? Maybe it was the sound of the hospital's old plumbing or a strange echo from somewhere else. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. Why would I hear children's laughter at 3 a.m. when the entire hospital was asleep? The hospital was quiet at night, save for the sound of machines and the occasional footsteps of a nurse checking. Children's laughter was something else. Unable to ignore the strange noise any longer, I mustered the courage to call out to the nurse on duty. I pressed the call button and waited. My mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing this bizarre noise. When the nurse entered, I asked her if there were any children in the playroom at that hour. She looked at me with a slightly confused expression and answered, "No, the playroom is locked at night. The only kids who are here are in their rooms, and they should be asleep." The nurse didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter had been so real, so vivid, that it wasn't just in my imagination. It felt like there was something in the hospital, something unexplainable. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the laughter I heard. I asked some of the other patients and their families if they had ever heard anything strange during the night. That's when I learned that I wasn't the only one. Other patients had heard it too. Some spoke of hearing children playing in the hallways at odd hours, while others described the laughter coming from the playroom. It wasn't just the occasional sound of a child's voice. It was the unmistakable sound of children's laughter, full of life and joy, echoing in the empty, silent halls. What struck me as even more disturbing was that no one had seen the children. No one could explain where the laughter came from. Eventually, I learned that there had been several reports over the years of strange occurrences like this in the hospital. The nurses had a saying, "The children never leave." Some believed that the hospital had been built on land where a children's ward once stood, long before the current building was constructed. Others thought it had something to do with the spirits of children who had passed away during their hospital stays, their laughter lingering in the halls as an echo of their lost lives. As the years passed, I became more accustomed to these strange happenings, but they never ceased to unsettle me. I'd often lie awake at night, listening to the whispers of children, the laughter. Sometimes the sound of I'll be waiting till I hear you say I do something new, something better, something good. I'll be waiting till I hear you say I do. Itself held on to its past, memories of children who had once filled the halls with life, now forever echoing in the empty spaces. It wasn't just my imagination or the side effects of medication. These occurrences were real.
Everything was perfect. You, this love was I'll be waiting till I hear you say I do. Something old, something new, something proud, something new. I'll be waiting till I hear you say I do. Cần mình cùng bên nhau, bao gian nan sẽ qua mau. Anh sẽ mãi luôn che chở em cuộc đời mãi sau. I do love you, yes I do love you. I'll be waiting till I hear you say I do. I do, 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 I do.
It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter for our family. We had just moved into an old, sprawling house on the outskirts of town. At first glance, it seemed like any other house, large, full of character, rooms that felt spacious and full of possibilities. But there was something off about it, something that lingered just beneath the surface, something that made me uneasy every time I walked through its and though I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, I couldn't shake the feeling that this house was different. We had been told by a realtor that it was once a hospital, decades ago. The history behind it wasn't something anyone really talked about, but the house itself seemed to whisper its past to anyone who dared to listen. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The strange sound happened shortly after that.
Phải lấp lánh, party xin cho tôi con giấy, party made, pop champagne, every day, ngày nào với anh cũng là party. Anh nhìn vào căn trong tay em ơi đừng đùa, nhà anh thế giới không phải chơi nửa mùa. Mềm chưa biết anh muốn tụi em đừng hùa, and Dre got the bag for sure. Rap anh Việt Nam nhưng mà chia tụi Mỹ xem giờ trên đồng hồ của tiến sĩ. Anh đẹp chân gái trên đôi giày LV, toàn là anh mặc fresh Vietnamese, chuyển lan đường dây cho Germany. Ta còn mình mà số ở VCB, cộng với anh làm make money. Anh làm nhạc thì lúc nào cũng lý, màu anh thích là màu vàng. Anh chơi là thằng không đầu hàng, bước vào club không phải xếp hàng, khách chơi là những bà. Anh có mềm yêu Cali, anh là mua sắm Paris. Anh thích ngắm hoàng hôn ở Bali, đắp đắp như gần nào Christian P. Anh có phải lấp lánh, Cartier xin cho tôi con giấy, Harley made, pop champagne, every day, ngày nào với anh cũng là party. Anh nhớ vào căn trong em ơi đừng đùa, nhà anh như thế giới không phải chơi nửa mùa. Mềm chỉ biết anh mua anh Balenciaga, không Dolce Gabbana.
I had imagined it, but then, just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again, louder this time, as though someone had knocked directly on the window. I jumped out of the truck, from the blind. The yard was empty, with a kind of silence that seemed to press down on me, suffocating any thoughts of rational instinct. The next day, I tried to brush it off.
Trong đêm miên
After
man
all,
đường
houses
dòng
make
cứ
strange
trôi
noises,
với những
especially
dấu
old
hiệu
ones.
dịu về anh mà
Maybe it
thôi.
was just the wind.
Em không
Maybe
trông
a
mong
loose
cuộc
shutter
tình
banging
ta luôn mê
against the
say vì
window.
anh gái đâu
That
chỉ
night it
yêu
happened
tình
again.
em.
This
Ngày
time it
xưa
wasn't
tình
just
trong
not.
vòng tay, muôn đời mình không đổi thay. Sự yêu đương mãi trong trái tim vẫn còn luôn đong đầy.
When I heard the
Giờ đây anh sát tầm
sound,
tay, trôi giặt về phương trời nào. Riêng mình em giờ đây lẽ loi mãi mong chờ anh người
they seemed to
ơi.
be coming from
Đêm bao
upstairs.
cơn mưa qua trong lòng em như thêm bao xót xa. Tìm đâu lời yêu dấu đang chờ kịp cuộc yêu nhau. Em không trông mong chỉ xin một đêm thôi anh nhớ đến em. Về bên vòng tay ấm bao ngày em chờ mong.
Slowly climbed the stairs, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Each step creaked under my feet as I moved toward the source of the noise. But when I reached the top of the stairs, everything stopped. The house fell silent again. My skin prickled with the sense that I wasn't alone. I checked each room, nothing, no one there. The house was empty, just as it should have been. But the strangest part, the next morning I found the scene.
Ngày xưa tình trong vòng tay, muôn đời mình không đổi thay. Chuyện yêu đương mãi trong trái tim vẫn còn luôn đong đầy. Giờ đây anh xa tầm tay, trôi giặt về phương trời nào. Riêng mình em giờ đây lẽ loi mãi mong chờ anh người ơi. Đêm bao cơn mưa qua trong lòng em như thêm bao xót xa. Tìm đâu lời yêu dấu đã trao khi vừa yêu nhau. Em không trông mong chỉ xin một đêm thôi anh nhớ đến em. Về bên vòng tay ấm bao ngày em chờ mong. Hai người có hay chẳng tình em. Nói một nhớ thương anh hoài mong. Biết rằng
something in that house was trying to get our attention, something that, no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, could not be explained. And as I look back, I can't help but wonder, did we unknowingly disturb something that had been resting for years? Or was it simply the house's past, echoing through time, trying to remind us of the many lives that had once passed through its walls? We may never know, but the mystery of the house remains unsolved, and the knocks to this day echo in my memory. The haunted hospital, a mother's terrifying experiences at a former community college. It's funny how certain places, despite their modern-day purpose, can carry echoes of their past. My mom's job at the local hospital was supposed to be a safe and stable one. She had always worked in healthcare. This particular hospital had an odd reputation, mostly with rumors and strange stories shared by the staff. It used to be a community college, but when the hospital opened, the building's past wasn't forgotten. Instead, it seemed
như thế nào người mình yêu không vui phải làm sao cứ thế trôi qua bao nhiêu tháng ngày em có hay đối với anh khi đưa ra hai con đường bỏ mặc em hay anh sẽ bên em dẫu có thêm bao nhiêu nỗi buồn hay nỗi đau anh sẽ bên
stories about things that shouldn't exist in the real world. One night, after coming home from a late shift, she finally told me what had been haunting her for weeks. She had seen a ghost. It happened late one evening when she was walking down the long, dimly lit hallway of the hospital. It was a stretch of corridor that no one really liked to walk along. But that night, she was alone. She moved down the hallway, a flicker of moonlight để nghe tâm sự của em dù cho con tim này vỡ nát dù một lần đã cố nói với em tình yêu em đã chọn thật nhiều nỗi đau rằng lòng mình chỉ biết nói với em lời quan tâm của một người bạn thân vẫn cứ lắng nghe con tim em như thế nào người mình yêu không vui phải làm sao cứ thế trôi qua bao nhiêu tháng ngày em có hay đối với anh khi đưa ra hai con đường bỏ mặc em hay anh sẽ bên em dẫu có thêm bao nhiêu nỗi buồn hay nỗi đau anh sẽ bên em vẫn cứ lắng nghe con tim em như thế nào người mình yêu không vui phải làm sao cứ thế trôi qua bao nhiêu tháng ngày em có hay đối với anh khi đưa ra hai con đường bỏ mặc em hay anh sẽ bên em dẫu có thêm bao nhiêu nỗi buồn hay nỗi đau anh sẽ bên em. A few months later, she had an experience so terrifying, it nearly pushed her to quit. It happened one night when she was asked to cover a late shift in the hospital's morgue. It was a job she had done before, nothing out of the ordinary, just paperwork and making sure the deceased were properly accounted for. But this night felt different. There was an oppressive silence in the morgue, and the air felt heavier than usual. As she was organizing some files, she noticed something strange. The room's lights flickered, casting long shadows on the cold metal tables where the bodies were laid out. She froze, feeling a sudden chill crawl up her spine. It was almost as if the air had shifted, and there was a presence, something that made her skin prickle. She dismissed it as nothing, probably just the lights, or maybe she was tired. But then the temperature in the room dropped drastically. My mom could see her breath, thin plumes of vapor hanging in the air. She stepped back, unnerved, when she heard a noise. At first, it sounded like a faint scratching coming from one of the morgue drawers. Then the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though someone or something was trying to escape. Terrified, my mom rushed over to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to open it. But as her hand reached for the handle, the noise suddenly stopped. The room was deathly silent again. Reluctantly, she opened the drawer, half expecting to find something or someone alive inside. But there was nothing. No body, no explanation, just the cold metal and emptiness. Still shaken, she turned to leave the morgue. But as she did, she felt a hand gently brush against her shoulder. Her heart skipped a beat and she spun around, expecting to see one of her colleagues behind her. But no one was there. She was alone, completely alone. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she hurried out the morgue. Her footsteps echoed in empty hallways. The feeling of being watched made her for the rest of the night. She couldn't shake the sensation that something was following her, something that didn't belong in this world. Experiences too much to bear. Strange sounds, weird figures, the sense of constant unease. It wore on her. Each night it seemed as though the paranormal occurrences grew stronger, more intense. Finally, after another unsettling night shift, my mom came home and announced she was quitting her job at the hospital. She simply couldn't take it anymore. Later, she would tell me that she was certain the building was haunted. The hospital may have been modernized, but the old college's foundation had never truly been erased. And whatever spirits lingered in those walls had found their way into the hospital's present. My mom wasn't the only one who experienced these strange happenings. Other staff members heard voices, seeing fleeting shadows.
Nơi anh kêu tan trong gió reo, sóng dâng bao la. Và từ đây mãi mãi mất nhau, mãi mang thương đau, mây đen giăng mơ, để cho ta dung ngâu đôi bờ, mãi chờ.
Whispers continued to spread about a haunted hospital, a ghostly little girl, and a terrifying experience that drove a mother to walk away from her job. To this day, my mom refuses to drive past that building, and she never speaks of it without a shiver running down her spine. As for the little girl,
Rằng cô luyến nhớ đã cách mấy năm mưa, ôi trong nhau xa vời vợi. Anh kêu tên em mừng, chẳng nói nên lời. Nước mắt rơi, lòng bùi ngùi, mình siêu nhau. Nghe tiếng mơ say gió tươi
a terrifying experience in a mental hospital. Some memories are so vivid that they are impossible to forget, no matter how many years pass. A young girl shared her terrifying experience in a mental hospital when she was just 13 years old. At such a young age, she faced horrors that words could hardly describe. At that time, she was going through a very tough period in her life. Separated from her family, she felt lost and alone. All of the negative emotions gradually built up, leading to an overwhelming psychological breakdown. She decided to confide in her therapist about her suicidal thoughts. This revelation led the therapist to inform her foster parents, and before long she found herself being admitted to a mental hospital for treatment. Upon arriving at the hospital, she did not receive the warmth she had hoped for. Instead, she encountered cold indifference and a lack of understanding. She was placed in a special ward for patients with serious mental health issues. It was here that she met another girl who would become the central figure in a story that she would never forget. The room she was placed in had a stark, white bed and a small window through which faint light streamed. Everything was dark and quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of a door creaking. The girl who would share the room with her was lying motionless in bed, eyes closed as if in a deep sleep. At first, the girl paid little attention to her new roommate, but when the young girl began speaking, The other girls started to respond. Hi, I'm the girl's name. I just got here. I'm here because of some psychological issues. Why are you here? The girl across from her opened her eyes slowly, stared at her with an intense gaze, and then said in a cold, eerie tone, I'm here because I want to kill you. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as if she were speaking about something trivial. A chill ran down the newcomer's spine. It was not a joke. This was a direct and disturbing threat. The girl didn't know what to think or how to react. Was she imagining things? Was this girl dangerous? Her heart raced with fear. Panicked, she quickly went to find a nurse, thinking that maybe the other girl needed help. When the nurse entered the room, the girl spoke, her voice shaking. She told me she wants to kill me, she stammered. The nurse didn't react immediately. Her expression shifted. She looked at the girl in the bed, and the words she spoke next were enough to freeze anyone in place. You need to move her to a different room. Go near her, the nurse said, her voice filled with uncertainty. It was clear that something was deeply wrong. The young girl was immediately moved to another room. She couldn't shake the fear that the girl in the original room might still be dangerous to her. In her space, she spent the night in the bed, to stop her from Was it all just a joke? Or was there something truly sinister about the girl who had made that threat? This event remained one of the most terrifying moments of her life. Years later, she would reflect on the situation, but even then, she couldn't explain the sense of dread she felt in that dark room with a stranger who seemed so eerily calm while uttering such a terrifying statement. The memory of that night had haunted her forever. Our stories are not just a warning about the complexities of the mind, but also a reminder that sometimes people encounter in life seemingly ordinary situations may carry secrets and mysteries that are beyond comprehension. The young girl would never forget that night, that dark room, and the unsettling presence of the other girl who had made that chilling threat. A ghostly encounter in the hospital. A nurse from the past. In 2009, a man was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a series of severe septic fevers brought on by a bacterial infection. It was one of those hospital stays where the hours seemed to drag on endlessly as he was hooked up to IVs and antibiotics, his body exhausted from the toll of the infection. It was a rough time, and the loneliness of being alone in a sterile, quiet room only added to the discomfort. One evening, as he was lying in bed, flipping through late-night TV channels to distract himself from his pain, something unusual caught his eye. He glanced toward the door, and there stood a nurse. At first glance, she appeared perfectly normal, just another member of the hospital staff coming to check on him. But there was something odd about her. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, not the modern blue scrubs the hospital staff typically wore, but an antique white gown with a bonnet and a red cross on the front. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that perhaps he was just seeing things. But when he looked again, the nurse was still there, standing at the doorway with a serene smile on her face. She raised one finger to her lips in a gesture that could only mean one thing. Shh, as if signaling him to be quiet. The nurse didn't speak. She just smiled, and then, as if she had been nothing more than a figment of his imagination, she quietly vanished from view, fading into the hallway. He lay there stunned, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Had it been a hallucination caused by his fever or the exhaustion of his illness? Was he just dreaming? The next morning, the experience seemed to linger in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the nurse dressed in that old-fashioned uniform. It was as though she had been someone from another time, yet she had appeared so real, so alive, and so present. Still unsure of what to think, he brushed it off as the result of his delirium, believing it had simply been a bizarre dream. However, as he was being discharged from the hospital a few days later, he was wheeled through the hospital's lobby when something unusual caught his attention. He passed a display case that held photographs from the hospital's past. There, among the photos of old staff members, he spotted a nurse dressed exactly like the one he had seen the night before. The same white gown, the same bonnet, the same red cross. It was unmistakable. He stopped in his tracks and stared at the photograph. His heart skipped a beat as the reality of what he was seeing began to settle in. The nurse in the photograph was not from his time. She was from a different era, likely decades before. He had seen her, or at least her spirit, in the flesh. The realization hit him hard. The woman he had encountered in his hospital room had been a ghost, a nurse who had once worked at the hospital long ago. As he sat there digesting this newfound understanding, he felt a strange sense of comfort wash over him. It was almost as if this spectral nurse had come to check on him, to make sure he was okay, to watch over him during his recovery. He couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that someone or something from the past had been there in his time of need. The more he thought about it, the more he believed the nurse was some kind of guardian spirit, watching over the hospital even long after her death. Maybe she had seen so many patients come and go during her life that, in death, she continued to serve in a quiet, unseen way, offering comfort to those in need. This wasn't the first time the man had heard of strange occurrences in hospitals, stories of people encountering the spirits of former staff members or patients who had passed away within the hospital's walls. Many had heard whispers of ghosts wandering the halls, offering gentle guidance or simply lingering in the background, unnoticed by most. One such story that came to mind was that of an elderly woman who had passed away many years ago in the same hospital. A nurse had recounted how the woman had always been a kind and gentle soul, caring for the patients with such compassion that even after her death, some believed she never truly left. Staff members who worked late shifts often claimed to feel a soft, invisible presence near their shoulders, as if she was still there, watching over the new nurses and doctors. The man couldn't help but think that perhaps he had been lucky enough to experience something similar. A ghostly guardian who had checked in on him during his darkest hours. As strange as it was, he had found comfort in the thought that someone from the past, a nurse who had once walked those halls and taken care of the patients with love and devotion, was still quietly doing her duty in the afterlife. Perhaps as hospitals are places where life and death intersect so frequently, they are more likely to harbor the spirits of those who once worked there, still lingering in their mission to care for others. And sometimes, in the most unexpected of ways, these spirits may appear to those in need, offering a kind smile, a gesture of peace, or even a simple shh as they watch over us from beyond. It was a chilling encounter, yes, but for the man, it was also a moment of deep reflection and gratitude. That ghostly nurse may have been long gone in body, but in spirit, she was still there, quietly doing what she had always done best, a haunting experience. After a life-threatening surgery, a child's encounter with the other side. When I was just 12 years old, I experienced something that would change the way I viewed life and death forever. It all started with a sharp, relentless pain in my abdomen. At first, my parents thought it was just a stomachache, but as the hours passed, the pain grew unbearable. We rushed to the hospital, where doctors quickly diagnosed me with a burst appendix, a life-threatening condition that could easily have killed me if I hadn't been rushed in for surgery. I was put under, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital room, groggy from the anesthesia, surrounded by machines and the quiet hum of the ward. My parents were by my side, reassuring me that everything had gone well. The recovery process, however, was far from smooth. The pain from the surgery was excruciating, and I spent the next several days lying in bed, hooked up to IVs, drifting in and out of a drug-induced haze. But it wasn't just the physical pain that made those days so unsettling. Something strange happened during my recovery, something that still haunts me to this day. It was around the third day after the surgery at about 4 a.m. when I suddenly woke up feeling unusually alert. The room was dark except for the soft glow of a faint light from the hallway outside. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I felt something strange, like a presence, a sense that I wasn't alone, even though the room was empty. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the medication playing tricks on me. But when I turned my head toward the window, I saw something that made my heart stop. Outside in the pouring rain, there was a woman standing just beyond the glass. Her face was obscured by the rain. I could make out her features, pale, disheveled, and unnaturally still. It was strange because the rain seemed to be washing her face away, as if she were made of the same mist and water. Her features blurred with each drop that hit the glass. But what was even more terrifying was the look in her eyes. There was something haunting about her gaze, like she was staring right at me, yet she wasn't alive. She looked like a ghost. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of my imagination, the result of the painkillers, or perhaps the dim light playing with my perception. But then she opened her mouth, and I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A high-pitched, muffled scream, like she was in agony or begging for help. Her mouth stretched wide, and the scream echoed in my ears, though it didn't seem to come from her directly. It was as if it came from the very walls around me, reverberating through my bones. The fear that coursed through me was overwhelming, and in that moment I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed, as though something inside me was shutting down. The next thing I knew, I blacked out. Everything went black, and I lost all sense of time. When I woke up again, the woman outside the window was gone. The terror I felt lingered. My heart was racing, and I couldn't explain what had just happened. It felt too real to be a dream, too vivid to be the result of medication. But I didn't want to believe it. I tried to tell the nurses what I had seen, but they just brushed it off, saying it was probably a side effect of the drugs or just a nightmare from the trauma of surgery. A few days later, as I was preparing to leave the hospital, I asked one of the older doctors about the room I had been staying in. He was a quiet man, someone who had worked there for many years, and I wasn't sure if he would even entertain the idea of ghosts. But when I mentioned the woman outside the window, his expression changed. He looked at me with a solemn face, and after a long pause, he said something I'll never forget. "You saw her, didn't you? The woman who died in that room." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He nodded, his eyes heavy with something that seemed like sorrow. "There was a patient who passed away in that room a few months ago. It was a sudden, tragic death. I'm sorry you had to experience that, but it's not the first time something like this has happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He didn't give me many details, but the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't imagining things. What I had seen, the woman in the rain, her scream, she had been real in some way. She was a spirit, a presence tied to that room, perhaps never able to move on. From that day forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to life than we could understand, something beyond the physical world that we live in. Was the woman's soul still lingering, trapped in that hospital room, forever connected to the place where she had passed away? Or had she come to warn me, to show me the fragile line between life and death? The experience changed me. It left me with a deep sense of respect for the unknown, for the possibility that there are forces beyond our understanding, forces that we can't see, but that are always with us, watching, waiting. And even though I recovered from the surgery and went on to live a full, happy life, I'll never forget that night, the woman outside my window, the scream that echoed in my ears, and the unsettling realization that death is never truly the end. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that room, but I know that sometimes in the quietest moments, when the world feels still, the veil between the living and the dead can grow thin. And perhaps, for some souls, they never really leave.
Em nghe rồi không? Từng hạt mưa đã gọi tên. Anh bỗng thấy thương cái bàng non.
The abandoned hospital, a horror film location, turns into a nightmare. A group of college film students, eager to find the perfect location for their horror movie, hears about an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. Intrigued by its eerie history, they decide to explore the decayed building, hoping to capture the perfect atmosphere for their project. Little do they know, this seemingly perfect location holds far more danger than they anticipated. As the group steps into the darkened entryway, their excitement quickly fades into nervous anticipation. The hospital, long abandoned and forgotten, is a maze of peeling paint, rusted equipment, and empty hallways that echo with every step. The air smells damp and stale, and the walls are covered in graffiti, remnants of those who dare to trespass before them. The group's leader, Jake, a budding director with a passion for horror, starts leading the way with his camera rolling. As they make their way through the building, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense. The sound of their footsteps reverberates through the silence, almost too loud, as if the building itself is listening to them. Then something odd catches the narrator's eye. A pair of well-worn sneakers, abandoned on the floor in the middle of a hallway. It's a strange sight in such a desolate place. Why would someone leave their shoes here? He mutters under his breath. They continue exploring, but the unease starts to grow. A few minutes later, another clue. A sleeping bag rolled up and neatly placed against a crumbling wall, as though someone had been using the space as a place to sleep. The air grows colder and the students exchange uneasy glances. Jake, trying to dismiss their growing concerns, jokes, maybe it's just a bunch of squatters. But his voice cracks slightly, betraying his own nervousness. The group decides to split up to cover more ground, with Jake and his friend Emily venturing further into the building. As Emily steps into a room at the end of a long corridor, she freezes. The room is filled with more bizarre and unsettling items, scattered belongings, food wrappers, and even a half-drunk bottle of water. It looks like someone has been living here. Suddenly, they hear a distant thumping noise. At first, it's faint, almost like the sound of footsteps. But as it grows louder, the tension skyrockets. They freeze, barely breathing. From the darkened hallway ahead, a figure emerges. A disheveled man carrying a baseball bat, his eyes wide and crazed. He stumbles toward them, growling under his breath, his movements erratic. He looks like he stepped straight out of The Walking Dead, his disjointed, jerky motions adding to the horror. The group's adrenaline surges and they turn to run, but the man shouts something unintelligible, his voice a low growl. He raises the bat and with terrifying speed begins to chase them, his every step sounding like a death sentence. They race through the hallways, desperate to find an escape. As the chase intensifies, the group realizes they've been led into a dead-end hallway. At the far end, there's a narrow gap, about 6 feet wide, leading to an open window on the opposite side. It's their only chance of escape. Jake turns to his friend Adam, who is lagging behind. You have to jump, he urges, panic rising in his voice. We can't outrun him. We have to get out now. Adam hesitates, his face pale. The gap looks impossibly wide, and the fall on the other side could be deadly. The sound of the approaching man, his crazed mutterings growing louder, forces Adam into action. With one deep breath, he takes a running leap, stretching his legs in an attempt to clear the gap. The seconds feel like hours as he hovers over the abyss, but just as his feet are about to hit the ground on the other side, his fingers scrape the edge. He makes it, but only just, falling into the dust with a heavy thud, his body aching from the impact. On the other side, Adam quickly scrambles to his feet, adrenaline flooding his veins. back, he realizes he's left the rest of the group behind. Emily, who is stuck in the hallway with Jake, shouts for him to hurry. The man with the bat is closing in, his steps quickening as he gains on them. With no other choice, Adam bolts toward the exit, calling back, "I'll find a way to get you out." His heart races, but he knows he's the only one with a chance to escape. As he bursts through a set of double doors into a courtyard, the cold night air fills his lungs. He's free, but his friends are still inside. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake manage to barricade themselves in a small storage room, the sound of the bat-wielding man pounding on the door. They know they can't stay there forever. The question now is, how long can they survive in this nightmare before help arrives? Or before the man finds a way in? As Adam looks back at the looming hospital, a chilling thought creeps into his mind. The figure they encountered, was he really alone? The hospital, once a place of healing, now seems to be inhabited by something far darker. And with every passing minute, the students realize that the horror they came to document is not just a story, it's their reality. Adam stands in the courtyard, his chest heaving with every breath. The old hospital looms behind him, like a dark monster waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. His hands shake, and the panic from his leap across the gap begins to set in. He tries to focus on finding a way to help his friends, but his thoughts keep racing back to the man with the baseball bat. His face, wild with rage, flashes through Adam's mind. That's not the face of a simple squatter or prankster. It was something much darker. Panic gnaws at him as he sprints toward the road, hoping to find a signal to call for help. There's nothing. No phone signal. The feeling of isolation is suffocating, and as he looks back toward the looming structure, a sense of dread begins to creep over him. It's as if the building is watching him, beckoning him to return. But there's no time to stand still. His friends need him. Inside, Jake and Emily are huddled together in a small, filthy storage room. The room is cramped, and the faint smell of mildew and rotting food makes their stomachs churn. They can hear the man outside pounding on the door with the bat, his growls and shouts echoing through the building. It's as though he's trying to break down their resolve as much as the door itself. Emily is visibly shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. We need to get out of here, she whispers urgently to Jake. We can't just sit here and wait for him to break through. Jake's mind races. There has to be another way out. He scans the room for anything that could help. Old boxes, rusted pipes, a window. Anything that could offer a path to safety. He spots a small, cracked window at the far end of the room, hidden behind piles of discarded hospital equipment. It's barely big enough for them to crawl through, but it might be their only chance. Over there, Jake says, his voice calm despite the panic that tightens his chest. We can climb through that window. Emily's eyes widen as she notices the window too. She looks down at her legs, still bruised from earlier encounters with the building's jagged surfaces. She isn't sure she can make the climb, but there's no choice. They move quietly, trying to keep their footsteps muffled, but the sound of the man's back hitting the door makes their hearts race. The door shakes with every impact, the hinges groaning under the pressure. Just as Jake is helping Emily towards the window, the door bursts open. The man with the bat steps inside, his wild eyes locking onto them instantly. His grin is twisted, as if he's savoring the hunt. The heavy thud of his boots echoing as he steps forward is the only sound that fills the room. You won't get away, he mutters under his breath, his voice harsh and low. He raises the bat, ready to strike. In a split-second decision, Jake pushes Emily towards the window, telling her to go. He grabs a metal pipe from the corner of the room, holding it up defensively as the man approaches with the bat. Emily hesitates for only a moment, but she knows she has to get out. She climbs quickly through the window, her hands trembling as she pushes herself into the narrow opening. Her feet scrape against the edges, but she doesn't stop. With a final grunt, she pulls herself through and lands in Jake isn't far behind. As the man lunges at him, Jake swings the metal pipe with all his might. The bat collides with the pipe in a clash of metal, sending sparks flying. Jake stumbles back but doesn't fall. He knows there's no time to fight. With one last desperate shove, he pushes the man backward and makes a run for the window. Jake's hands are bleeding from the sharp edges of the broken glass around the window, but the pain doesn't stop him. He pulls himself through the gap, barely squeezing his body past the jagged edges. Just as he feels the bat-wielding man lunge for him, he makes it to the ground on the other side, landing with a painful thud beside Emily. They're both breathing heavily, looking around in desperation. The building looms behind them, its dark windows like watching eyes. But there's no time to rest. They hear the sounds of heavy footsteps approaching. The man is still coming. Emily grabs Jake's arm. "We can't stay here. We need to run. Now." They don't look back as they sprint away from the hospital, their hearts pounding in their chests. The road ahead is a blur as they make their way toward the highway, their feet pounding against the dirt. But just as they think they've escaped, the ground trembles beneath them. The man is close. They can hear his labored breathing getting louder, his steps getting heavier. Adam, now back at the road, is waving frantically at a passing car, praying for someone to stop and help. He's about to give up when, finally, a truck pulls over. The driver, a grizzled old man with a thick beard, rolls down the window. "What are you kids doing here?" he asks, his tone gruff. "We need help," Adam pants. "My friends, they're still inside the hospital. There's a crazy man with a bat. He's after us." The driver looks wary but nods, grumbling something under his breath. "I know that place. It's not safe around here. Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff." They drive as fast as the old truck can go, the hospital disappearing behind them in the rearview mirror. As they approach the sheriff's office, Adam breathes a sigh of relief. They've made it, at least for now. But as they reach the sheriff's office, Adam looks at the others. Jake and Emily are silent, their eyes haunted by the terror they just faced. They know that whatever they thought was a simple film shoot turned into something far worse. And they can't help but wonder, was the man with the bat just a part of the hospital's twisted history? Or is something darker lurking within those walls? As the sheriff prepares to head back to the hospital with them, Adam can't shake the feeling that they've only scratched the surface of something much more horrifying. The sheriff, who's seen his share of strange happenings in the area, looks at them gravely. "Kids should have never gone in there. That hospital's been abandoned for years, but strange things have been happening nearby for just as long. It's not the first time someone's gone missing in that place." Jake turns pale. "Missing? What do you mean? Who else is there?" The sheriff's face darkens. "There's more than just one person living in there. You've stumbled into something far bigger than you think. If you think the hospital is abandoned, well, it's not." And with that chilling thought, the group realizes their nightmare is far from over. What began as a simple location scout for their film has turned into a terrifying journey, one that may have no escape. The abandoned hospital, it seems, is only just beginning to reveal its darkest secrets. The sheriff's words hang in the air, thick with dread. Adam, Jake, and Emily exchange uneasy glances. The idea that the abandoned hospital is not truly abandoned, that there are more people living inside, maybe even more dangerous than the man with the bat, sends a cold shiver down their spines. "We need to go back," Jake says, his voice steady, though his eyes betray the fear he's trying to mask. "We can't just leave without knowing what's really happening in there. We can't just walk away from this." Emily, her face pale but determined, nods. "We have to make sure no one else is trapped inside." But the sheriff doesn't share their resolve. "You kids don't get it," he said sharply, gripping the wheel tighter. This isn't just some twisted joke. That hospital, it was closed down years ago after a series of disappearances, strange incidents and rumors. People said the building was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who died there. Others thought it was a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to go. They weren't just hiding, they were living there in the shadows. Pauses, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. I've tried to go in before. People have tried. No one comes back the same. Some never come back at all. Adam's stomach churns. He can feel the weight of the sheriff's words bearing down on him. He had thought the danger was over. They'd escaped. They'd made it out. But now it seemed like the hospital itself was pulling them back in. As the sheriff's truck approaches the hospital once more, the group sees it looming in the distance, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. The air around it seems thicker now, almost suffocating. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and the sky is a deep shade of purple, casting long shadows across the grounds. Stay close, the sheriff warns, reaching for his rifle in the back of the truck. This place is like a labyrinth, and if you don't know how to navigate it, it'll swallow you whole. The group disembarks from the truck, their faces tense and grim. Adam is determined, though every nerve in his body screams to turn around and run. They can't stop now. They need answers. The moment they step back inside the hospital, it's like entering another world. The air is colder, heavier. The faint smell of something rotten lingers, and every creak of the old building makes their hearts skip a beat. As they move deeper into the corridors, the sense of being watched intensifies. It's as if the building itself is alive, breathing with them, waiting for something. Cautiously explores, sticking close to the sheriff, who seems to know these hallways like the back of his hand. The deeper they go, the more unsettling the place becomes. In one room, they find more of the old out-of-place items, shoes, food wrappers, sleeping bags, even photographs of people they don't recognize. A sense of unease starts to creep in again. Were these people once part of the hospital's staff, or were they patients who never left? The sheriff leads them to the lower levels, into the basement. It's dark here, and the air is thick with the smell of decay. Echoing sounds, whispers, footsteps, the sound of chains rattling. It's impossible to tell, but the tension in the air is palpable. They reach a room at the end of the hall, hidden behind a rusted door. The sheriff hesitates before pushing it open. This is where it all started, he says quietly. You'll understand everything when you see it. The door creaks as it opens, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old medical equipment, broken glass and decaying paperwork. In the center of the room lies a large rusted desk, stained with something that looks like blood. The walls are covered with strange symbols. Some of the chalk there is legible, smeared in rough white words. At first it seems like just another creepy part of the hospital, but then they notice the photographs, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They're all faded, yellow, and what stands out are the faces of hunters, their faces,
mong manh như khói mây em như cánh hồng dịu dàng giữa trời ngồi trên nghe bước em về có quen thôi hết mong chờ ngồi trên nghe bước em về có quen thôi hết mong chờ ngồi trên nghe bước em về
This place doesn't just trap people, it keeps them here, and it keeps their souls. A sudden bone-chilling noise echoes through the room, an inhuman growl. The group spins around, but the room is empty. Then the sound grows louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seem to move, taking on strange, twisted shapes. Get out of here, the sheriff shouts, his voice now full of urgency. Now! But it's too late. The door slams shut behind them, and the hospital seems to come alive. its dark corners and decrepit walls shifting as if to trap them. Figures emerge from the shadows, pale, gaunt, and silent, their eyes hollow. The people who were once part of this cursed place are still here, not just as shadows, but as something much worse. Their forms are flickering, like they are caught between worlds, unable to move on. The man with the bat, the same one who had chased them earlier, appears from the darkness, his wild eyes now filled with fury. He steps forward, raising his bat as if to strike. "Run!" the sheriff yells. "Don't look back." Jake, Emily, and Adam sprint toward the hallway, but the hospital seems to stretch endlessly, as if it's purposefully elongating itself to keep them trapped. The shadows chase them, and the growls grow louder. The bat wielder isn't the only threat now. They're surrounded by these tormented figures, their faces twisted in silent screams. Just when they think they're finished, Adam spots an emergency exit at the far end of the corridor, glowing dimly. "There," he shouts, "the exit." They race toward it, the sound of footsteps and growls closing in behind them. The door bursts open with a forceful push, and they tumble out into the night air, gasping for breath. Behind them, the hospital stands silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. They don't stop running until they're far from the hospital grounds, the distant, looming building disappearing from view. As they finally collapse on the side of the road, the sheriff, panting and covered in sweat, looks at them gravely. "I tried to warn you," he says quietly. "The hospital is not just abandoned. It's a prison for the lost souls of those who once walked its halls. Those who try to leave, they become part of it. You barely escaped, and I fear you won't be the last." The group is silent, unable to comprehend the full weight of what they've just endured. But as they look back one final time, the faintest whisper seems to come from the wind, as if the hospital itself is calling them back. It's not over. The hospital is waiting, and it won't let them go so easily. And the hospitals are places where stories of life. They are also
trên môi những đóa hoa thật tươi, em đẹp nhất khi em cười và xin chớ quên lời anh đừng để vụt mất cười say. Em đẹp nhất khi em cười và xin chớ quên lời anh đừng để vụt mất.
Quý vị có trong nhã nào?
It's during these overnight shifts when the rest of the world is asleep that the boundaries unlike any other. The corridors are empty. The only sound the monotonous hum of machines, occasionally punctuated by the soft shuffle of slippers or the sighs of exhausted staff. The air seems to carry a weight, as if the walls themselves are holding on to the countless stories they've witnessed over the years. A sense of calm, mixed with an undercurrent of unease, settles in. And it's in this eerie silence that the strange stories of hospitals take root, stories that continue to haunt those who work long into the night. One such night, Dr. Williams was on duty, working the night shift on a nearly empty medical floor. This floor, typically reserved for patients in critical condition, had only a handful of patients that night, each of them hanging on to life by a thread. Among them was Mr. Peterson, an elderly man in his late 80s who had been in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. His body was stable, but there was little hope. The doctors had all but given up on him, and his family had already said their goodbyes. He had been unresponsive for so long that everyone had prepared for the inevitable. The end seemed imminent. Yet that night, as Dr. Williams made his rounds, a sense of unease was in the air. The hospital, as usual, was quiet, eerily quiet. But there was something different about the atmosphere tonight. As he walked down the long hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room, he noticed a faint sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whispering coming from somewhere down the hall. At first, he thought it was just the usual mechanical noise, beeping and buzzing of hospital
mùa xuân
machines.
ơi
But as he listened more intently, he realized that it was something else entirely. The whispering wasn't coming from any machine. It was as if someone was speaking very softly, almost to themselves in the distance. Dr. Williams felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just the chill of the cold hospital air. It was the sensation of something strange, something unexplainable, lingering just outside of his understanding. His instincts told him to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand. But something in the back of his mind kept tugging at him, urging him to investigate further. He shook off the unease and continued down the hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room. As he approached the door, the whispering faded, but a heavy silence hung in the air. He paused for a moment, glancing into the room through a small window in the door. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the floor. For a moment, he saw nothing unusual, but as he pushed open the door and stepped inside, he froze. There, in the bed, lay Mr. Peterson, awake. The old man's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. It wasn't just the fact that he was awake after being in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. It was the eerie calmness in his gaze, as if he was looking beyond the room, beyond the walls, into something that no one else could see. Mr. Peterson, Dr. Williams asked, his voice shaking slightly. He had seen many things in his years of practice, but this was different. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The elderly man slowly turned his head, his eyes locking with the doctor's. For a moment, there was a blankness, as though he didn't recognize the doctor. But then, as if something clicked in his mind, Mr. Peterson's face softened and he whispered, "She's waiting. She's leaving us tonight." The doctor's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the room, half expecting to see someone else there. The room was empty. "Who's waiting, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted, his eyes focusing on something just over Dr. Williams's shoulder. His expression was serene, almost peaceful, as though he was seeing something the doctor couldn't. "She's here, waiting for me," he said, his voice growing fainter, as if speaking to someone beyond the room. Dr. Williams felt a sudden chill creep over him. It wasn't just the temperature of the room. It was the feeling that something was present, something unseen, yet very real. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. A shiver ran through him. The atmosphere in the room had changed, shifted into something unfamiliar and unsettling. It was as though Mr. Peterson's words, though whispered so faintly, had unlocked something in the air, a presence that couldn't be explained. The doctor stayed for a few moments longer, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But no answers came. The whispering, the eerie calmness in Mr. Peterson's eyes, and his cryptic words. Everything about this night felt out of place. As he left the room, Dr. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just occurred. Something he would never be able to explain. He looked back at Mr. Peterson one last time, and for the briefest of moments he thought he saw the old man smile, as if knowing something that no one else could ever understand. That night, as Dr. Williams made his way back to the nurse's station, the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't from down the hall. It was right behind him, faint but unmistakable. "She's waiting." The hospital, with all its stories of life and death, had just added another strange chapter to its long, mysterious history.
Anh đã
And as the
quen
night shift
trong
dragged
cay
on,
đắng
Dr. Williams couldn't help but wonder who was waiting.
ngày nào
What had
em
Mr.
yêu
Peterson
anh
seen in those final moments?
em
The
hẳn
rest of them had
quên với
missed.
trời
From the
hạnh phúc
sheets.
mới
It was too deliberate, too soft, like a
em ơi
conversation happening
đông
just
lại
out of
về
earshot.
từ trăm
Sent a
năm
chill up
lạnh
his
giá
spine.
tim anh như
Dr. Williams
ngừng thở.
paused in his tracks,
Sau
straining his
tình
ears to
đó
catch any coherent words.
em nghe
He stood there for a
không
moment, in the quiet of the
mùa
corridor,
đông
trying to dismiss the sensation creeping
mùa
over him.
đông
The hospital had been known for its
ngày
strange
nào
occurrences,
ta xa
lights flickering
nhau
on their own, doors
mùa
This
đông
felt
theo qua.
different. It wasn't just an odd
Anh
sound.
đã
It felt like
quen với
something was out of
đỉnh
place.
đời băng
Something was
giá.
watching. He shook off the feeling, deciding it
Xưa
was just
hôn
an
em
illusion.
một lần,
Proceeded to Mr.
rồi
Peterson.
đau thương tràn lấp.
As he approached the door,
Anh yêu em
whispering seemed to
một
grow
ngày,
fainter, as
rồi
though
xa em
retreating into
trọn
the
kiếp.
shadows. His
Nên
mind
anh
raced
yêu
through
mùa
various
đông,
rational
nên anh
explanations.
yêu
A
mùa đông.
malfunctioning speaker
Ôi
system,
mùa
a
đông
nearby patient
của anh.
whispering in their sleep, but nothing seemed to add
Anh
up.
chỉ là người điên trong vườn hoa tình ái. Anh chỉ là người say bên đường em nhìn thấy.
Mr. Peterson's frail,
Em đi đi, người điên không biết nhớ, và người say không biết buồn.
same scene every day after day.
Những cuộc tình dương gian muôn đời không nghĩa lý, nhưng người vẫn tìm nhau trong vòng tay tình lý. Như đôi ta, niềm yêu xưa chỉ còn một vì sao anh lẽ loi. Trời lập đông chưa em, cho lúc rơi đi tìm giấc ngủ vội. Để mặc anh lang thang ôm giá băng, ngỡ thầm người yêu tới. Đến chia ly em về, đường khuya em bật khóc. Anh xa em thật rồi, làm sao quên mùi tắm. Em hỡi em, có phải tình băng giá là tình đẹp trên thế gian? Người điên trong vườn hoa tình ái. Anh chỉ là người say bên đường em nhìn thấy. Em đi đi, người điên không biết nhớ, và người say không biết buồn. Những cuộc tình dương gian muôn đời không nghĩa lý, nhưng người vẫn tìm nhau trong vòng tay tình ý. Như đôi ta, niềm yêu xưa chỉ còn một vì sao anh lẽ loi.
As though he had been waiting for this moment for a long
cho
time.
lũ
His
rơi
eyes,
đi
though
tìm
clouded
giấc
page,
ngủ
now seemed filled with understanding, as though he had been given
Để
a
mặc
glimpse
anh
into a world
lang thang,
beyond the one they
ôm
occupy.
giá
She's
băng,
here.
ngỡ
She's been
thầm
waiting for
người
me,
yêu
Mr.
tới.
Peterson whispered again, almost lovingly, his voice
Đêm
thick.
chia ly em
Dr.
về,
Williams watched in
đường khuya
silence,
em
a
bật
sense of
khóc.
dread creeping over
Anh
him.
xa em
The
thật
room,
rồi,
which had once
làm
seemed
sao
so
quên
sterile
mùi
and
tắm.
empty, now felt
Em
charged
hỡi
with an energy
em,
that he couldn't
có
explain.
phải tình băng giá là tình đẹp trên thế gian?
Was it the voice of this mysterious woman Mr. Peterson had
Em
been speaking
hỡi
of?
em, có phải tình băng giá là
Just as
tình
Dr.
nồng
Williams was about to
hai
speak,
chúng ta?
His eyes closed once more, as though he had been given a final moment of peace. The faint whispering that had filled the room earlier died away, leaving only the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the silence that enveloped the room. The doctor stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Had Mr. Peterson truly seen something? Had he been in touch with something beyond this world, or was it simply a product of his delirium brought on by the days of unconsciousness? He couldn't be sure. As he left the room, his mind was still spinning, trying to find logical explanations for what had just occurred. But deep down he knew that sometimes some things could never be explained. Hospitals, after all, were places where life and death intersect, where the line between the known and the unknown often blurred, leaving behind stories that defy explanation. And as Dr. Williams walked back down the corridor, the whispering seemed to follow him, soft, distant, and unsettling, as though the hospital itself held on to its secrets, waiting for the next person brave enough to hear them. Dr. Williams felt a strong shock. Mr. Peterson, whom he had mentally prepared for the almost certain death, was now waking up. His eyes were wide open, but they did not look like those of a conscious person. His gaze was absent, as if he were looking at something only he could see. The feeling was indescribable, like